Hello everybody, this is Serpent, and welcome back to another YouTube video. This one's going to be about Feathers and Flames again, and I should first probably apologize for how long it's taken for it to come out, because I originally intended to release this much sooner, but needless to say I've been quite busy. So this is going to be the technical details video for Feathers and Flames, and that's this whole pretty desktop environment, the ricing setup, if you will, in case you don't know. I expect this video will be useful for people who have installed the system already and want to configure it to their liking, but also to people who might want to fork the project or contribute or make something like this themselves. So I'll be going into a reasonable amount of detail on pretty much all of the pieces of this project. And the scripts are not complicated, but there's a fair bit of it overall, so I expect the video will take a little bit of time. I'll try to make that more useful for you by adding chapters in the description, where you can find sections with relevant information for a certain component that you might want to learn more about. All right, let's get into it. I feel like a reasonable place to start would be just exploring the folder structure a little bit so that you have an idea of what all the different pieces are. So first we've got some top level scripts. These are the ones that kind of operate at the highest logical level. For example, the clone script here, which is basically the first point of entry into the whole installer, but also things like the update script, which again is kind of the first entry point to the scripts in general when you're running an update. With the license and readme, which show up on GitHub. And then I've got a pull changes script here, which is used to gather changes that I might make to the configs. That was useful a lot more in the beginning. I don't really use it so much anymore because the configs are quite well developed at this point. But back when I was making lots of changes to each of the configs, I wanted to make sure that I had an up-to-date copy of them here in the project file. And so I just made this little script here, which pulls them from their various locations in the config directory. So the main interesting script at the top level here is install, as you might imagine. And what this one does is it orchestrates the whole installer. Clone over here. This is what's run when you run the curl fssl. This one, I'm not going to run that for obvious reasons. Actually, I can show you if I curl the contents of that web page. You can see it's just another curl command, which contains an uglier link to the clone script on the master branch of the GitHub repository. So that first curl command is really just an alias for this clone script. The clone script clones the repo, puts it into the right location, and then essentially just runs the install script. So then, yes, back to the interesting parts of the installer. As I mentioned, it's very top level. It doesn't do anything directly itself, it just orchestrates other scripts to do things for it. And that helps keep things clean. Actually, originally when I was making this installer, I was mostly thinking of myself because my approach to security is compartmentalize and respawn. And what I mean by that is that you keep everything separate, and if one of them is compromised, then you wipe it and you reinstall. And that saves a lot of hassle because you don't have to try and figure out, oh, is it compromised really? Can I clean it somehow? No, you just have a backup, wipe it, chuck the backup back on. Simpler and safe. And what that means in practice for me is that I want to make everything very, very easy to set up if I wipe my system. And that's where this installer idea came from originally. But anyway, I'm getting distracted now. One of the first things you'll see in most of these scripts is this line up here, which is the vars script. And if we go over to that script, all it does is set a bunch of variables. It helps keep things clean because this way I don't have to keep writing out full paths. One of the next things that I call is this errs script, and this handles errors for us. So if something goes wrong, you get a message, you get a little bit of advice, and it tells you you can rerun the installer and it will try to fix things for you. One of the other things you'll see popping up in these scripts is temp clear or temp spawn. And what those do is they spawn a temporary directory in my project directory here. We go over to temp spawn, you can see it. First we get the variables, and again, over here, temp files, feather helpers / temp files is the temp directory. So I spawn that and clear it repeatedly through the installer to just have a safe little place to work with transient files. All right, now you know what temp clear does and the vars and stuff. The next big thing here is the sel-comps. And one of the big parts about Feathers and Flame is that you can select the components that you want and leave out the ones that you don't. I wanted it to be very pick and choose what you want, or just Control A and everything works. Originally, I was working on a fork of Omarchy, and I was a little frustrated by Omarchy because it was very not customizable. And I have opinions. Sure, it's an opinionated distro, but I have opinions too, and my opinions are just as important as yours when we're talking about the system I'm installing on my own computer. So that was a little irritating to me, and I found it easier to just make my own thing rather than trying to fight the architecture that was already in place on the Omarchy project. So here's the architecture that I figured out and why I think it's nice. Sel-comps over here. What it does is it handles a state file. So now we're getting into the script file helpers state. First things first, gather the variables. Where are these files? And selected install, pending install are the imported files here. So if we go over here, we can see my selected install for this system was this. And that's just the gum choose command piped into the T command. So what I'm doing there is I'm asking for user input and I'm writing it to the selection file. But I'm also writing it to the pending file. And that's because I want to know what the user selected, but also what has actually successfully installed. Because if I know those two things, then I can try and pick up where I left off in the installer if there was actually an error during the installation. There are several different ways you can call sel-comps. The first one is generate, and what that does is it'll ask the user and write the files. And that's what we get the very first thing when you run the installer, sel-comps generate. I think I'm actually going into way too much detail here because it's already 12 minutes into the recording and I have not gotten very far. I'm going to be a little more cursory now. So you can generate the files or you can operate on the files. And you can operate either on the normal file or the pending file. And what are those operations you can do? Well, you can fetch, which fills a variable fi selection with all of the selected components, or you can check a certain component, you can remove a certain component, or you can add a certain component. I use sel-comps later down the line to figure out what components were selected, which ones have been successfully installed, which ones are yet to be installed. And you can see the next thing we run after generate is fetch to get that variable of the selected components. So then we ask for confirmation, and then we run the actual installer. The installer iterates over the selected packages and it runs the corresponding scripts. That's the highest level of logic in the script folder over here. Not all of these are present as installation components, and also not everything in this list, Vintage Story for example, is prompted for in sel-comps. See, Vintage Story is not over here, so you can't automatically install the Vintage Story component because it's not ready for production really. And I'm also not entirely sure if that's an appropriate thing to put in the installer for everybody. But nevertheless, all of the components that are installed here are installed directly from the script directory here. And each component is its own little thing, its own little script that does some installation logic for you. I'll start going through those in a minute, but I'm going to skip on so that we can finish with the install script first. So the installer, after running all those installation components, next runs migrations. And this is something that I added in the very first update to Feathers and Flames because I realized that the lack of logic in that regard was really going to cause problems if I didn't handle it immediately. So migrations are a way of updating existing systems to be in line with the current expectations of the scripts in the project folder. If we go to migrations, you can see it's a modified version of what's used in Omarchy, because why reinvent the wheel? And I like this logic mostly. I had an issue with some of their logic, but not all of it. Most of it's good. When you clone the repository originally, there will be a number of migration scripts. So in the script directory here, and each of these does something that brings the system a little bit more in line with the expectations of the script. So for example, the JQ package I noticed was missing for certain script functionality, the mirror monitor keybind, but it wasn't installed automatically. And so that led to a dependency issue where that keybind didn't work. And if I want to install JQ on other people's systems after they've run the installation initially, what I need is some script that will run only on old systems. And in general, that's what a migration is. It's a script that runs only on old systems. So when you clone the repository, it will contain all of the migrations that should already have been run if your system were old. And so these migrations shouldn't be run on the new system. And what this script does is it will mark all of those migrations as run, all of the ones that already exist, and then all of the migrations that appear afterwards are not marked as already run. So if I were to add another migration, it would not be marked as having been run for anybody who updated this system. And so I can see that in the update script, run the migration, and then mark it as run. And so it will not be run again if you were to update a second time. That's, I think, very slick logic. I like it. And you can see over here, we have a variety of marked as run migrations. Oh, there's a number 4 is missing. Which one is that? Ah, yes, there was a hack on the AUR. I remember that. Good times. So yeah, that's what the migrations do, and that's why we run migrations set done right after the installer installs all of the components. Cool. Are you having fun? I'm having fun. So after the migrations are done, we've finished the installer. So we just print a happy message and ask if you want to reboot, because rebooting is nice after you install a whole bunch of things. All right, now that was probably the part that is least useful to literally all of you. So now let's move on to things that you might actually care about. How do you actually install cool stuff on the system in an automated way? I do think organization is important. I'm not going to discount all of the stuff I just talked about, but realistically, it's not what's most important probably to people watching. Cool. Okay, what do these components actually do then? So first we have packages. What packages does is it will ask you what you want installed as extra programs, extra packages. It will also install necessary system packages, which are listed here. And at the end of it, it will run a few simple setup scripts, depending on what you installed, to make sure that that thing works as well as I expect it should. So the packages component is quite minimal, and I recommend it, as you may have noticed in the installer. If you don't select the packages component, I can't guarantee most things will work. You may have to do some troubleshooting or shoot me an issue on GitHub. Actually, before I move on, maybe I should mention the cool little selection menu. The sysextra, media, and AUR packages are package lists. They don't do anything themselves. So if we open up sysextra, for example, it's just a list of packages. These are their names in the official repositories. And that's important because they're going to be used to install those packages if you select them, so they have to match. So the select install script, yes, indeed, originally part of OMRG. Why reinvent the wheel? Well, it is modified. So this script will record which packages were selected, and it will filter them by whether or not they're AUR packages, because those have to be installed differently. It uses fzf to present the menu and fetch information about the things. Fzf here is the command that actually displays the little picker. And then the output of that is chucked into filter user selected AUR, which writes them to the files for later. And then I can install them all at once. And that way you don't have to wait in between each selection for installation to run. So from file and from file AUR are very simple scripts which just take those package lists and actually install them once you've selected them. Next up, we have Autologin. Autologin, again, very simple. I assume SDDM is installed and slightly configured by the cachyos installer. I actually intend to expand support to other distros in the future, so I may actually have to bulk up this script a little if my expectations are not met in other distributions. But cachyos sets things up for us, and all we have to do is write a little file here, autologin.conf, which tells SDDM to automatically log in to the given user with the given session. You may notice the user here is hard-coded as me. That's probably not useful for most people. So immediately after I said that file to switch user from Serpent to the actual user. That's something that you'll notice a little bit. I have a whole bunch of config files. Quite a few of them involve my username or my home folder path or something like that. And so I have to update those to be the current user's name instead of my name. So that's Autologin. Next, let's go to LazyVim. Also quite a small file. I mean, most of them are pretty small. This installs necessary dependencies, and I noticed that if I didn't install some of these manually, things were kind of problematic. Unsuccessful lazy extra installs and crashes and things, errors. So yeah, it installs those dependencies, it makes backups and copies files into place. This backup script and backcp, I should probably also mention, you might be able to gather what they do. Backup makes a backup, and if you add the -m, it will move the current file into the backups directory instead of just copying it there. So it will remove it from its current location and place it in this other place. And then backcp, it copies something into some other thing, and if that other thing exists already, it will make a backup of the other thing before replacing it. I always use backup before modifying a file, and I always use backcp when I'm trying to replace it or place a file in general. And what that means is that if something goes wrong, you can always go back into the backups folder here, which is in Feathers and Flames. It's git ignored. And each of these are time-stamped, and you can go into the timestamp and you get a file path to the actual files that were modified. Theoretically, all you have to do if you want to revert a backup is copy straight from the timestamp here into the root folder. But I think it's probably more sensible to put a little thought into reverting the backup instead of just blindly copying into root. But yeah, it's a non-destructive installer, so your config files are safe. So LazyVim itself is just a configuration specification of NeoVim, and what that means is that it's just config files for NeoVim. And feather-c contains my tweaks on top of LazyVim's configs. I can show you that over here. NeoVim. See, it's just LazyVim with some extra tweaks. And then I also noticed one thing which was not very nice, which is NeoVim didn't by default play nicely with Nautilus. I press enter, nothing happens. That's no good. I double click, nothing happens. The default nvim.desktop over here, well, this is not the default, but the default one does not use this exec command right here. What it uses is just nvim file, and it has terminal set to true. I honestly don't know why that doesn't work with Nautilus. It seems like it should, but it didn't. So what I do is I say terminal equals false, and then alacrity execute nvim file. And so it launches alacrity, which immediately launches NeoVim. So that custom desktop just overrides the one that doesn't seem to work. All right, that's LazyVim. Now let's go to the browser installers. And this is a little interesting because this is where we actually have to do a little work. So the default here is Mullvad, which is the normal browser that I use on a day-to-day basis with the VPN. And then if Tor was specified, we switch some of the links. The interesting thing here is Mullvad provides a link that dynamically reroutes to the latest download, whereas Tor does not. So in Tor's case, I have to actually go from the download page here, which it's not a direct download. I have to curl that and then grep it a couple of times to find which version is actually latest, because somewhere in there is the version number of the latest Linux build. And once I've found that, then I can use that version explicitly to dynamically find the latest download. But I can't just use a static one because it will go out of date and stop being hosted. So I have to actually parse the download page a little bit in order to find the link, which is kind of fun. Anyway, once we've figured out where to download the thing from, we spawn a temp directory. We download the zip file or the tar xz or whatever. We remove previous attempts to install it in case this is a second time, and we extract it, and then we have it try to register itself, and it always fails. I don't know why it fails, but I mean, I do know why it fails. It produces a broken desktop file, but I don't know why the desktop file is broken or if that's an intended feature of the installer. Anyway, once it's made itself a broken desktop file, we have to fix it and then make it executable and put everything in its right place. And then we can clear the temp file because we don't need the actual zip that we downloaded initially. And after all that, then we can say it was successful. And Mullvad is just a fork of Tor without the Tor network. So it's the best you can get for privacy without using Tor. And then when you use it over a VPN, it should provide, in theory, equal protection, but higher bandwidth speeds and less blockable. So it's one of the best privacy options available. And because Mullvad is just a fork of Tor, I can use exactly the same installation process. They produce exactly the same broken desktop file for themselves, and I can fix it in exactly the same way. So that's Mullvad and Tor. So next on, I'm just going to skip Vintage Story because it's, like I said, it's not ready yet. I can show you if you want the script here. It's just trying to extract the game files and install a couple packages and set up a desktop. Anyway, if you play Vintage Story, you can just run that one. TLP, also quite simple. I was following along the Arch wiki page here and just translating their instructions into commands. One of the things that you have to look out for when installing TLP is that it might conflict with an existing Power Profiles daemon, which I then have to remove in order to install TLP. TLP provides the same functionality as Power Profiles daemon. I install various packages for it. These are all useful if you have TLP. And then I enable relevant services and mask relevant services. Again, that's just following along the Arch wiki page. That basically concludes TLP. I've been experimenting actually. You remember I wiped my system pretty often. This time I didn't select TLP. when I was installing. I think I may in fact be getting better battery performance, which is a little sad. I might have to remove the recommended for laptops suggestion because it seems probably to only be an improvement on certain laptops, maybe not most of them. I'm not totally sure. I remember reading online that everybody's saying, well, TLP can never be worse than Power Profiles daemon. It's a drop-in replacement, always better. Double your battery life, stuff like that. It seems like it's maybe not quite that clear-cut. So Gamemode, again, is something with its own ArchWiki instructions. This is the program that's supposed to give you better game performance by optimizing the system during the game's runtime. First, we need the packages, then we need to add the user to the Gamemode group, then we need to add a config file because Gamemode doesn't have its own default config file that pre-installs, and that's done by back copying from my config directory, the default, which I can show you in just a second, to the target location. Then we can enable the Gamemode daemon service. So yeah, what is that file? It's over here, and this is just the defaults from their GitHub page. Next on to desktops. So I found after installing cachyos a whole bunch of unnecessary things showing up in my launcher here, and that annoyed me. I only want things here that are actually useful. Potentially a couple of these are not actually useful, but most of them are, the vast majority. And that's done by hiding the ones that I don't like. So I made this hide desktop script. It sets no display equals to true, regardless of whether or not it exists and stuff. That's done by modifying the ones in user share applications. And since doing that, I've realized that I can override them by placing a hidden desktop in the local share applications, which is probably the better way of doing it. But this is not really problematic because the only difference is that when you update, sometimes these default desktops are overwritten. So I change it and then it's overwritten and then I run the refresh command and change them again, which is a little sloppy. I have to admit that. But in my defense, if we're arguing for sloppy, then you could argue that this way, if they update their desktops, I'm not overriding them with an out-of-date hidden desktop. And what that means is that if some of these are used in the background by something else, and they're updated to fix a bug fix, maybe add some environment variables to their launch to account for behavior that they didn't in the first place, then users of the system would get the updated versions of those desktops with the fixes and hidden. So it's not actually a terrible idea. The counter argument to this is that, well, then why don't you just copy them after every update into the local share and modify them there? And yeah, okay, maybe that's a better way. Keep my grubby paws out of user share. But, you know, it works pretty nicely, to be honest. Let's move on to wallpapers. Leave that all behind us. I wanted to be able to give people pretty wallpapers, but pretty wallpapers have less pretty license restrictions on distribution. And the way to get around that is to download them at install time and then copy them into place. But if I'm downloading something from the internet, I want to make sure it's not a virus, especially since there are quite a lot of wallpapers here, and they might be gathered from a variety of different sites, which aren't terribly trustworthy. To make sure that I'm not distributing viruses to my users, what I do is beforehand, I will download it myself, and then I'll run SHA-256-sum on it. You can do this on any file. SHA-256-sum test.py, for example. And what that does is it'll give you a cryptographic hash of the file contents. If we modify this file, print u is full file, and save that, and then we run SHA-256-sum on it again, you can see the hash has changed. So what that means is that I download the image, I make sure it's safe, then I get this hash of it, and then I store that hash in wallpapers.txt. Over here is the download path for all of the wallpapers, the link to download from, and then the hash of the safe file. So if the file that's downloaded at install time doesn't have the same hash, then it can't be trusted, and I delete it. And here's the logic for that. So when I installed cachyos, I noticed that in Nautilus here, I didn't have an option to open the terminal here. And to make sure that actually happened, because this is very useful, especially since you can press, here's a cool tip, you can press F10 to open this menu, and then use the arrow keys so you never have to touch the mouse. Good stuff. So I wanted that option, and to make it appear, I had to use gnome terminal, which installs something from the AUR, one of the few things, and it follows the installation instructions for that package, which you can find, I think, on this at this GitHub page. So next up is MIME types. MIME types are the information about which application is supposed to open by default which kinds of files. This should also have a no marchy notice at the top because it is a modified version of their MIME types file. I'll try to add that soon. But the general idea is that you call xdg mime a lot to tell the system which desktop file is used on which kind of file. So image ping gets imv.desktop. Image JPEG also gets that, etc. And you can figure out what kind of file something is with xdg mime query, I believe, file type test.py. And this is text plain. But of course, what you can always do is right click, open with NeoVim, always use this file type. NeoVim, boom, and then there we go. So that's not such a big deal if it's just a single file type. But yeah, it's nice to have most of them set by default. All right, that's MIME types. Can you feel it? We're almost done with the installer. Amazing. However, we still have configs and SDDM theme. So this is probably what you expected most of the video to be about, but in reality, it's just this script. Most of the functionality in this project is not really the nice configs, but everything around the nice configs. Although the nice configs are nice. So I've already mentioned how backcp works, and my original intention was to use it just basically on the config files, and it ended up being used on more than I expected, but I guess you could probably define most of what it's used on as a config file. Anyway, we have Niri, Noctalia, NeoVim, Alacrity, and Qt config files to place here. And those work together to make most of the actual desktop environment that you see here. Colors, the keybinds, the settings here, a lot of good stuff. Qt, by the way, is a commonly used windowing framework that allows you to theme it. So having these config files covers a lot of different applications. Most KDE applications use Qt. Later in the video, I'll go through basically all of the config files, but for now, all we have to know is that I put them into the right places here, and then I update the user, as I mentioned earlier, to not be my name, but rather the current user's name. One of the things that was pointed out to me shortly after I released this project was that if you selected a non-US keyboard layout during the cachyos installation, that choice was then overridden by my configs, which is not a great thing to do. The way the layout is specified is through a Niri config file, and it's recorded in localctl. You can see this is the information about my keyboard layout, and that's what the cachyos installer sets and where it's expected to be read from. But it's kind of hard-coded in your Niri configs once you've installed Niri, so I actually have to, again, sed the layout from my default to the one that was selected during installation, and that's what these two lines do. And that's the config script. So the final component here is SDDM theme. What this is SDDM is the login manager. It doesn't look very nice by default, and originally I was expecting to just skip the login manager screen entirely by Autologin, but I realized that if you're doing a gaming system, you might not want an encrypted hard drive. If you don't have a laptop, then it doesn't make a lot of sense to have an encrypted hard drive, right? Because it's never leaving the house. So you might as well not encrypt your drive in that situation, or those situations. But then you have to see the ugly login screen. One of the first issues that I got was that the login screen didn't follow the theme of the rest of the system. And there are theming projects available on GitHub, which contain a few files that theme the login screen to match Noctalia. And what I've done is I forked one of those and modified it a little to fit into the project better. I didn't want to constantly sort of asking people who installed the system to clone from this random guy's GitHub repository, and I couldn't guarantee then that if he changed something, my scripts wouldn't also have to change. So I forked for stability and control, and that means that I have read through all of that code myself, and I know that it's safe, and I know that it will stay safe because I have control over the fork. If there is an update, I can then vet that update and pull the update, but in the meantime, I have a stable, safe fork for people to clone from that fits in with my system. So here I'm basically just following the instructions on that GitHub page. You can read the README at this link if you care. But the idea is that you copy the folders into place, and then you use the Noctalia theme.conf, which just tells SDDM to use the Noctalia theme as the current theme. The way SDDM conf files work is that you have this SDDM directory, and then any conf file in that directory will be applied to SDDM. So you can kind of categorize things a little bit and keep them independent of one another. And that's nice for automation here, because I know I'm not going to overwrite the previous one that sets the autologin. We want that login screen to match up with the current background and theme, remember? And to make that happen, Noctalia has to be able to write to the theme.conf file and the background.ping file. The change mod here allows those particular files which exist in this privileged location to be written to by Noctalia. And then there's a little bit of logic here to write that user template for Noctalia. Clear the temp files, mark it as complete. Okay, well, we've finally finished the installation logic. I was originally thinking of going through all of the project's logic and all of the config files in one video. I don't know if that's a good idea at this point. Just looking at the rest of the things that are here, the content of the project kind of splits into two nice groups. There's this first one that we just did, which is installation. And then there's the second one, which is what it actually does once it's installed. In terms of what it does once it's installed, we have the config files, of which the largest is the Niri files. And then we have other script files that are run after being installed. So that's things like the screensaver and the sharing files, yeah, things like that. And then there's how to configure your wallpapers and your wallpaper presets. So I think this is actually a good place to stop for this video. We've gotten through the installer. The installation logic is done, and in the next video, I can show you what actually happens once it's installed. What is the contents of the config files? But at this point, you should have a good idea of how such a project is structured, where you want a custom installer, you want to configure a whole bunch of things on the system, and you want to be able to run updates in a controlled manner later. Actually, before I leave you, I'll just open up the updates script, because I say that, but we haven't looked at it yet. The update script, it fetches variables, shows the logo, asks if you want to upgrade the whole system, and then what it does is it goes to the Feather project folder, and it just git pulls. So it just updates the state of all the script files to the modern state on GitHub. And then we have that migrations desync, which is used to figure out which migrations need to be run. I've already mentioned that earlier in the video. Then we have the refresh script, and it refreshes certain settings that need to be kind of babied a little bit after an update. And then we just show the done spinner. So the settings there, we use that sel-comps script to check whether configs were installed or whether desktop entries were installed. And then we source deploy refs on configs and refresh the desktop script just by running it again. And the desktop script we've already seen. It's this one. Hides a bunch of desktops and stuff. The configs deploy ref script is a little bit more interesting. I forgot to show you that. So what I did when I refactored the Niri configs is that I separated them into kind of user properties and system properties. And the system properties, I placed control of those in the Feathers project directory and then referenced them from the main Niri config. I'll show you how that works in more detail later, but the main idea here is that system functionality exists within the scope of the Git project, which means that it's updated with the git pull command. So I can update system configs of Niri just directly by git pull. And that leads to really smooth updates for those system files. The downside is that it's a little less flexible for user configuration, but I think it's a good balance that I've struck here because I still expose nice places to write your own user configs. It's just that it's harder to edit the system ones for the user. I'll get into that more next time. But the point here is that referenced configs exist in the Git repository, and they have to be deployed, which means that they are copied from their location in the Niri folder here, copied from there into config ref, which is git ignored, and config ref is respawned after every update, and it's setted to change the user to the current user's name. So that's how I keep a git controlled portion of my settings that still have a dynamic username. So that's config reference, which is refreshed in the refreshed script, which is run on update. Okay. That was a lot, but now we've gone through clone, errors, install, pull changes, refresh, update, vars, all of the installation components, all of the installation logic, the update logic, and why it has to be that way. I think I'm done for now. This video should then be a comprehensive overview of that functionality, the installation functionality, and next video I'll do the same thing for now it's installed. So stay tuned for that if you're interested, or feel free to use these videos just as a reference with the chapters in the description. So anyway, nobody's probably watching at this point in the video. Have a good day. Take care. Bye-bye.